Baba yetu yetu liye mbinguni, yetu yetu amina. Baba yetu yetu liye jina lako litukuzwe. Baba yetu yetu liye mbinguni, yetu yetu amina. Baba yetu yetu liye jina lako litukuzwe.
Howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of Meta Ideological Politics. I'm your host, Ryan Nakata, and boy, do we have a doozy for you today. I'm joined by three titans of the meta/sense-making web to discuss everyone's favorite new book, The Dawn of Everything. As many of you know, this book has created quite the splash in our communities. And as usual, polarization and vituperative clashes of all sorts have cropped up in every corner of the internet. And being the depraved mediator and conflict fetishist that I am has gotten me hot and bothered and itching to explore these debates further. What interests me most are the accusations flung at each other, namely the label ideological, implying we're projecting our biases, political agendas, conceptual frameworks, and other distorting heuristics onto the nebulous gestalt of human prehistory, in turn warping the facts to fit our preconceived notions. Interestingly enough, I haven't seen much contestation of the facts presented in the book themselves, but rather the conclusions people are drawing from them. So in this discussion, I'd like to explore how we can shed light on the subtle and not so subtle frameworks and narrative structures that shape how we make sense of this book, and the relationship between facts and the frameworks themselves, which include how we reason from granular evidences to big picture meta-narratives and vice versa, and the myriad ways our personal biases and ideological leanings jump in to shape the picture. As Brendan said, we have ourselves a battle of meta-narratives, and what better place to battle out the grand story of human civilization than on the Meta Ideological Politics podcast. Here's how we'll proceed. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to make an opening statement, giving their general take on the book. And once everyone has spoken, we'll glide into an extemporaneous battle royale format. Having myself just started the book, I plan on taking a backseat in this discussion, but plan on jumping in with some premeditated gotcha questions in the unfortunate event that things start going too smoothly. With that, welcome, gentlemen.
Howdy. Good to be here.
Hello.
So Brendan, I want to start with you since you are new to this podcast. So 10 minutes, the floor is yours. And if you want to include both your general take on the book and the kind of meta-narrative conclusion that you're drawing yourself from reading it.
Cool. Okay, thanks. I have some scattered thoughts that I'll try to weave into a more or less well-articulate narrative, which is in some ways what this is all about. Yes, so I've written a couple pieces on the book so far, just sort of a couple initiatory passes at some of this. I think that you raise a great point about the focus so far that's been on ideology versus getting into some of the more granular evidentiary claims and seeing how valid or invalid those are. And I think that that's for a reason. I think that one first gets a sense of where a work is coming from and the sort of general methodological framework that an author or authors are using in order to help situate, to situate the work, really. And so I feel like it's warranted, I think, this concern about ideological framing, and that's sort of a initial work that needs to be done up front, and then we can get into some of the evidentiary sort of debates that might be there, which could be very rich. It's also, I'll just say that up front. And so I think you did a good job framing why that's the case in terms of biases sort of directing the narrative, rather than, as we tend to assume, the various data themselves sort of being abstracted into a narrative that we are not imposing on them, but that the realities are sort of generating in a broad pattern. The way I was thinking about this and how I think the meta-narrative issue here is playing out too is about the issue of coherence and how we make coherent narratives out of materials. Just as a little backdrop here too, and I'd like to, I think it'd be valuable and interesting to see where we're all coming from with the text in terms of how much familiarity to in terms of these sorts of works and what sort of broad field this would fall in terms of anthropological and ethnographic studies, but also synthetic sort of grand big history aggregations of anthropological data and things of that nature. So to that point, I'll just say up front that I don't claim any expert status in that field generally at all. I mean, of course, in the sense that you're making a synthetic broad view picture of history, you're eschewing specialization at that point, and you're going to be doing generalizer work in some capacity. My particular specialty is in ancient history, as it's sort of located in the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman classical civilizations. I did my BA in classical civilizations. And so I have some familiarity with the field generally of archaeology and anthropology and ancient history and prehistory. Now I did that, 15 years ago at this point or so. So, there's also a very important way in which there are claims about new evidence that are involved here. And so, but anyway, just to sort of situate where I'm coming at from this work or coming into it with a particular lens, having done some general survey stuff in the sort of like dawn of history, cradle of civilization sort of materials. And so in terms of that, this is obviously and very explicitly presenting a very different narrative from the one that, my studies kind of presented, and that is, they admit sort of the consensus view. So that's my kind of way into this, and helps kind of frame a little bit of why I kind of taking the take that I do. But to return to the idea of coherence, I just want to touch on this real quick, because I think it's important that if we're taking this sort of big scale vision first and looking at the ideology first before we kind of get into the granular narratives here or the granular evidence, what the challenge here is one of, I'd say, resolution and how this impacts the way that we coherently shape narratives. So if you want to think about two broad sort of heuristic approaches to looking at reality, there is sort of a generalizing take and there's a particularizing take. There's sort of the resolution of large and small. And another way of thinking about this would be maybe imagine like sort of a data plot, right? Now you've got a bunch of individual data points that are sort of plotted, and these are each an individual datum in a broader sort of data set. And so at that point, you can kind of engage data in different ways. You can generalize, which would be to say, well, is there a line of best fit that we can sort of map onto this? Is the data more or less telling a coherent tale that we can sort of abstract from it and sort of compress some of that noise into the basic sort of essential signal? That's sort of one way of going about it. Another way is particularizing each datum and sort of zeroing in and looking at each one. And then not only that, but even potentially focusing on outliers, things that don't necessarily fit that general line of best fit. So these are forms of resolution taking that can kind of zoom out and zoom in, and both of them have pros and cons. And so I think the cons of generalizing are that they can be reductive, they can be deterministic, they can be ultimately totalitarian, in which you're sort of reducing too much of the specificity and you're sort of being moved along by these blocks of ideas rather than allowing the data to speak for itself. And similarly, there's a con of the particularizing approach, which is that you miss the forest for the trees. It's that you get a fragmented and an incomplete and an incoherent picture, because there is no thing tying all the various data together. It's just sort of a scatter plot, and there's nothing that's sort of emerging from it that gives it a coherence. And so in sort of Vervaekean terms, I think you could look about this as trying to find optimal grip, which would be one way of, I think, what really valid and quality historiography is trying to do, which is letting the individual data points speak for themselves while also allowing them to reveal a broader generalizable picture. Now, tying this into ideology, this is where this becomes, I think, really interesting, because I think it's not unfair to see as characteristic of, say, modernism, a generalizing tendency, and of postmodernism, a very particularizing tendency. And so when you are doing historiography through a sort of modernist lens, then there are certain what's the word, drivers that lead to generalization, abstraction, the big picture takes. And one of the things that happened, of course, with postmodern historiography was to sort of push back against that and say, hey, wait a second, and this is, of course, all set in political context for all the reasons why that played out in terms of the very real ways that modernist generalizing can lead to totalitarianism at a political level is a very real thing. So the postmodernist approach tended to focus on particularity, letting each individual speak for itself, and focusing on outliers, on what's happening at the margins, not following the broad trend, but looking at, well, hey, how does this nuance a generalized understanding? Now, last thing I'll say about this is that, just to tie the fact that these generalizing, particularizing approaches are both general tools in our tool belt for making sense of the world, but they also tend to play out in ideological frameworks and in cultural epochs more broadly. And that I would argue, and here's all, I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll just finish up with this, a kind of Spark Notes version of, I think, one of my main takeaways is that this book is certainly coming from particularist, outlier-driven analysis that I think people rightly associate with a more kind of postmodern lens, and the associated ideological framings that often come with a postmodernist particularizing lens, such that ultimately one of the main takeaways of the book is basically that the pattern of history is that there is no pattern, that the law of history is that there are no laws. And of course, the idea of law, the lack of laws, plays very much into another set of kind of political ideologies of the authors, which I'm sure we'll be talking about more. But I just wanted to throw all that out there because I feel like this is one of the big things that I find about this book as being problematic in terms of how I think about quality historiography, which is more about finding the optimal grip rather than taking an extreme sort of radical particularist outlier driven focus. So that we can hopefully get into some of that. That's my first go here.
Fantastic. Jeremy, I'll turn to you.
All right. So yeah, so okay, let's see. We got 10 minutes here. Yeah. So generally, some of my context and background for this book is I'm coming from more of a sort of Gipserian approach to the whole history of consciousness. So some of the claims the book is making, generally speaking, are much more resonant with my own way of thinking about the history of consciousness, even though that's not what this book is talking about. It's sort of giving us a different kind of big picture history. And maybe to kind of start off, I'd push back a little bit with saying that I don't necessarily think this is more about particulars and outlier positions. I think the book is doing two things. The first is drawing from the last 20, 25, 30 years of more contemporary archaeological and anthropological data, which is slowly aggregating towards a new consensus, which is not something that I think is particularly outside the realm of what your average anthropologist would claim. Like, okay, well, they don't really believe in a stadial model, et cetera. Things are much more complex. I mean, generally speaking, that's sort of the in vogue turn in academia at the moment with historiography and archaeology and anthropology, is that things are more complex than we imagined. Things go further back than we imagined. Things are not as linear as we would have imagined previously. And generally speaking, the archaeological and anthropological evidence does point to that. But that's not just what the book is doing, The Dawn of Everything. It's taking a kind of emerging paradigm shift, generally speaking, which I don't think is too outlier at this point, and drawing some conclusions and creating a kind of big picture narrative. And the work is interesting in this sense, in that it's transdisciplinary, in that we have an archaeologist and anthropologist that are collaborating with each other to give a different image of history, which nevertheless does look a lot less linear than we imagined it to be previously, or is commonly understood to be mythologized previously by the Pinkers or the Jared Diamonds of the world, right? Those are the kind of narratives they're kind of going after and saying, hey, nobody's even talking about that anymore in anthropology or archaeology. There's a lot more complexification that's occurred. So I would just say that I don't think it's an outlier position. I do think it's a bit more granular in that sense of looking at specificities and contrary evidence. Let's say, drawing from James C. Scott's work about how agrarian societies did not necessarily create a coercive state, but they existed for a few thousand years, right? Without that, this is not necessarily outlier work, but I think the political project of the book and the overall meta framing of the book, which is a big picture image of humanity as basically the three freedoms that they conclude with, right? Like we have these sort of primordial freedoms they can draw from all of these examples of social morphology and plasticity, that the ability, the freedom to move, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to create a transform society. And they think, generally speaking, that this sort of makes up most of our history, the ability to kind of shift back and forth in a very conscious, socially conscious kind of way, different forms of social organization. And these are their conclusions they draw from. And they certainly take more anarchist and more kind of leftist positions towards things in terms of critiquing the Pinkers of the world and the kind of problems of modernity, et cetera. And we can kind of say, like, those are the two layers here, right? There's the actual evidence of seasonal dualism, which are not just anomalies, but kind of a growing sense of complexity of our prehistory, and then their own political project, right? Which I think is more geared toward a more left-leaning and anarchist view of history. And certainly that's always been the case with Graeber and the Democracy Project and so on. So that's kind of like the framing there. And just as more context, like I think most of us here, I don't have an anthropology background or archaeology background. My wife does with anthropology. So we've had some interesting conversations about these readings, but I have a background in consciousness studies. So this is definitely a subject I think we're all reading about all the time in terms of, the dawn of humanity, the origins and history of consciousness. How did human beings evolve through these different great epochs of history and social organization? Is it linear or less linear, right? And I think my takeaway from this book is it's really emphasizing the nonlinearity of history, the ways in which we've moved back and forth with this greater complexity. That this is kind of, despite our particular orientations around politics, despite that, the book is saying history is more complex, it's far less linear than we imagined, there's way more nuances and plasticity that's going on that sort of challenges a kind of stadial orientation of moving from step to step to step in a kind of neat way, or even a kind of back and forth sort of way, right? There's examples of societies that have that are socially moving alleged up and down stages of from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states, right? There are examples of indigenous societies that had some kind of coercive state. There are examples of agricultural societies, again, without a coercive state. So the fluidity and complexity here is certainly being presented, but it's being presented in a big picture view of the human being as a socially dynamic and free being, right? Imagining and reimagining ourselves with our material histories at hand. So that's the big picture. It's just not looking for a direction necessarily. And I do have some pushback, perhaps a little bit around the question of why did we get stuck, which is what they ask about, and they comment on social inequality, et cetera. I think there's some things we can actually say about that, more so than maybe the authors were putting forward in the text. And there are some ways in which I feel like the text could be opened up more dynamically to, let's say, our field with William Irwin Thompson's work on cultural ecologies, for instance, or let's say Gebser's work, which go, those kind of depthful questions about why did we go this path? Why did civilization go down this direction? And what does that particularly mean for the big picture, right? Those things I think could be addressed better. But again, I think, as generally speaking, the book kind of blew open all of these possibilities. It presents an image of a dynamic, complex history and a dynamic and complex human being, right? So that I'm going to close there, just to kind of say this is what the book is doing for me. It's really opening up a conversation about the shifting paradigm of our history.
And last but not least, Layman.
Well, it's my understanding that Jeremy Johnson is a depraved Marxist radical who holds nothing sacred and who sees in this text another vicious revisionist weapon in his campaign against Western civilization and the unsuspecting community of developmental stage theories in an insurrectionary campaign for some kind of mad, directionless planetary utopianism. And Brendan Graham Dempsey, if that is his real name, seems to be some sort of proto-fascist, neo-colonial, hyper-conformist religious fanatic who hates women and will stop at nothing to use academic nitpicking to protect white Judeo-Christian values and the normative status of a developmental narrative that leaves the savages in the dust. Hopefully, I will be able to provide a single sane voice and some much needed balance among these two rabid extremists whose views, frankly, put us all in serious jeopardy. That said, I enjoyed this book a lot. I think it has 3 goals and does all of them pretty well. It is not the big book of official integral historiography, nor is it the new gospel of anti-developmentalism. I think the Davids are simultaneously trying to provide an updated history sourced in the richness of new discoveries and some alternative theorists, while also doing some philosophical anthropology by trying to capture and present certain principles that they find repeatedly through their lensing of this enriched historical data set. And they're also quite transparently trying to connect the richer social variations of human history with their own political commitments, which I think quite sensibly involve a serious critique of the ethos of modern political economies, whose accumulating problems won't be dealt with unless we open ourselves imaginatively to the reality and normalcy of different ways of organizing our cultural activities. There are some phrasings and some dismissals and trivializations in the text that maybe make my delicate meta sensibilities wince a little bit. But on the whole, I think our culture war trained ears tend to exaggerate the significance of these rhetorical gestures, assuming maybe too quickly that they are windows into already well-defined paradigms that we have to provide a quick thumbs up or thumbs down for. And I think that's unfair to the deepest insights and the most important conclusions that the authors are trying to bring forward. I think a charitable reading should appropriate their rich topology of social history and use it to challenge forth a more complex, hopefully more accurate and more humane version of historical developmental philosophy. But that's also not the only useful thing you could do with a book like this. You can also, for example, place it in the context of other histories and try and build up a meta historiographical vision. That's important. You could look closely and sift around in the details for that dotted fault line that might indicate where passages are following more to the postmodern or more to the meta-modern side. Those are good things to do. And all of these responses, I think, are deeply complementary. But in addition to all of that, for me, there's another interesting phenomenon that goes on with this book, which is it and some other texts reveal what seems like an underlying polarization within the liminal web of our overlapping communities, right? Whether it's Graeber or Nora Bateson, some integralites and meta-moderns have a strong immediate sense of vindication when they hear these critiques, and some have a strong immediate feeling of suspicion and weariness and counter-critique. You know, and why is that? Is it because the community that purports to be second tier is actually staffed with a lot of postmodernists? Is it because people who share a cognitive worldview still differ considerably in their emotional, ethical, or social intuition development? Or is it because something basic like a left-right polarization is present here as it is everywhere? So I think Ryan's doing us all a service, providing a space for us to dig into some of those kinds of questions. Where am I coming from? I'm a hetero cisgendered Canadian male of mixed European, Moorish, and Neanderthal descent, currently making an insufficient amount of money. By temperament, I tend to assume that everyone is actually getting along somehow, even if it doesn't look that way. By training, I tend to be charitable and non-reactive in my readings. I'm spiritually oriented. I have my own complex developmentalism model. I would say I'm a meta-progressive with strong, sometimes idiosyncratic conservative sympathies. I do think the scale and tempo of contemporary accumulating problems is not being addressed at all unless we start making changes that will feel like they are too big and too fast. And if we're not doing that, we're basically being passive radicals, consoling ourselves with moderatism or nostalgia or some kind of strange woke hysteria. All of that and the deep desire for the overlapping wisdom community spaces to be more practical, more embodied, more project-oriented, more survival-oriented. All of that is the way that I situate my reading of the text and the way that I will be trying to distort the meaning of this book to serve those particular ends.
Thank you, Layman. That was probably the hardest I've ever laughed on this podcast. I had to a lot of energy into containing myself and trying not to shed too many tears. So that was great. Now let's, for this next, I don't know, 45 minutes or so, I know there are some disagreements or pushbacks. I wanted to kind of open the space for you all to explore that with each other. I know that none of you agree with each other 100%, and maybe we can start by teasing out what those distinctions and perspectives are, and then maybe organically move towards a point of convergence. And then to end it all, I have a challenging question for each of you. So just opening the floor here, whoever wants to take it and maybe push back or explore a difference with someone said in their opening.
Take that if that's all right with folks. That was great, and I love this, by the way. This is so rich and enjoyable and necessary, and it's really wonderful to lay all this out on the table and see each other face to face and have these kinds of conversations and do all that. And anyway, so it's wonderful. I wanted to throw out one of the things for me that, so Jeremy, you brought up the linear, at one point you said, is it linear or less linear? The question about human history and human origins. I think that's a great way of framing this. I think, though, so one of my concerns and interests here is the issue of straw manning, where a certain view of something is maybe presented in a low resolution, more kind of caricatured way that then becomes easy to sort of undermine and knock down, and then present an alternative and a contrast to. It's important because I in my reading of the book, I would argue that I see a lot of that at play, which again, historiographically makes me a little uneasy, especially when you're encountering a work that's presuming to add complexity and nuance to a conversation. And if you're familiar with a certain subset of the data, for example, and you realize that this isn't getting an entirely fair treatment, then that kind of has a cascading impact on how you view the rest of the argumentation that goes on. And so I think it's important to be able to avoid that. Of course, steel manning being the alternative, or titanium manning, and the idea of being able to present frameworks here in their most robust form. And so one of the things too, why I feel like this is really important, is because I wonder very much if there's not just a lot of shadow boxing going on, that when these fault lines emerge, it's sort of like there's a projection in a straw manning, probably inadvertently almost all the time, of assuming what another person's position is and then immediately presuming, well, that can't be the case. And so so the question of, is it linear or less linear, to get into that, I feel like this is a great way to frame some of this, because I think there's sort of a straw man version of the developmentalist approach to some of these issues, that's sort of like, oh, the basic narrative is that humanity progressed in a purely linear, stadial process from, simple savagery to complex civilization or something. And while certainly some people may hold that kind of view of these sorts of things, I would say that is not in any way sort of the standard approach in the communities that we're all sort of interacting with, whether it's these integral circles or metamodernism. There's a great deal of, when you read authors like Wilber or the Hanzi books, ways of trying to bring in all sorts of potential axes of nuance and difference and possibility, and ways that a whole number of complex variables are interacting in nonlinear ways, such that when sort of developmental stage theory models of human history are sort of rebutted, whether that's just with a simple stage theories or BS, or basically there are no meaningful applications of stage theories, which is, I think, one of the main premises of this book. It's, for me, sort of a knockdown of a straw man. And I would argue that it's very possible to engage, as I think Layman talked about, having a very complex developmental model where your level of generalization is of an appropriate amount, that you are able to appreciate the patterns while not losing sight of all the outliers, and effectively accounting for those divergences and those alternative histories and those possibilities of human potential and human organization, and that any developmental model worth its salt would be doing that. So I just wanted to throw that out there in the way of thinking about, is it linear or not? For me, I feel like it's sort of a red herring. As long as there's a sufficient degree of depth and nuance to developmental argumentations about human history, I would presume that there's not any sort of simple linearity being proposed. And therefore, if the argument goes, well, see, this book is saying it's not a linear progression, therefore, yeah. So that's my basic argument there. Again, for me, this is about coherence. It's about being able to find these lines of best fit that do propose. So I'll end with this sort of analogy. If you think about like a galaxy forming, right? Or the possible permutations that exist when matter coalesces throughout the universe, right? You might get binary stars, you might get certain kinds of galaxies that, you know, have black holes in the center and of different sizes, and stars of different sizes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the possibilities are just, you look out in the sky and you see them all, but we're still able to sort of abstract from this broad panoply of variability, certain laws of physics, certain general trends of complexification. And so for me, it's about maintaining the options of diversity while still finding that line of best fit that can account for it. And so that's why I feel like if we have too simplistic and caricatured version of what a developmental model of stage theories look like, then we're not really undoing that at all. And we're sort of speaking past each other. So I wanted to throw that into the mix.
Yeah, I'll just jump in if that's good with you, Ryan and Layman. Yeah. I mean, I generally agree. I think any kind of approach, any kind of big picture history approach or evolution of consciousness approach has to find that middle balance. But the question is, right, and you mentioned this yourself earlier, just about, you know, taking the too broad of approach, right, is the critique of that is it doesn't look at the particulars and it kind of forces things to look a particular way, right, about going in a certain direction, or let's say this can't exist at this stage. It really doesn't come online until this point in history. If there's a general progression, if there's a general, let's say, developmental logic, and then we get enough contrary evidence that says, well, this is sort of against the developmental logic. This couldn't have appeared without this being in place first, right? Which I know it's not straw manning, because it's part of the way Wilber and many of the developmentalists argue. And they even kind of make these distinctions and say, with Wilber's pre-trans fallacy, for instance, right? I mean, the whole thing is about like what comes before versus what comes after, and possibility, and not conflating the two. So the directionality is what's being questioned here. And I don't think that asking for or pointing out complexity and saying like, well, here's a society that does seem to be able to coalesce and aggregate around what we would consider to be a state, which happens later on. But this is happening in a completely agriculture-less society, hunter-gatherer, hunter-foraging, capable of doing that, or switching back and forth. I think there is a level of complexity in there that is challenging these stage theories in a way that is authentically complex enough to say, well, maybe the general shape of how we're creating those sort of stadial theories needs to be more dynamically accounted for. And maybe that's not, you know, to be clear too, I don't think Graeber and Wengrow are really saying that. They're not really trying to argue for a more complex meta theory of human consciousness evolution. They're just sort of painting this much more complex picture of our political and social histories. I think this is sort of our conversation, right, amongst the integral, metamodern, liminal groups about, you know, where, how useful is stage theory? How straw man versus how steel man can we really get when some of the big claims are being contested, right? Even with the nuance and the perpendicularity and different lines of development and states versus stages, there's a lot of complexity that those models certainly bring in, but there's also these generalizations that they do continue to work with, that I do think that, again, some of these new histories are challenging quite a bit and would benefit us by looking at those complexities and going, okay, does developmental logic work like that? Or do we need to kind of rethink how that general shape of consciousness unfoldment occurs? And just to kind of add the loop back as a final note into context for me, you know, a model like the Gipsarian approach, which is a bit more rhizomatic and it's in a kind of mutational model, to me is like very, very compatible with something that Graeber and Wenger are doing here, right? Because it does not relying on that kind of developmental logic to talk about consciousness unfoldment or efflorescence, where I think, again, certain theoretical approaches in our field they do require that developmental logic to make it all kind of work. And again, they're very sophisticated and robust, but there's different premises. And I do think texts like this and the actual history like this are challenging for something different here, right? There's the nonlinearity isn't being accounted for that they're talking about here, and it shouldn't be strawmanned as saying like, well, we have complexity in our models, so there's something interesting going on there. So I'd like to see more of that, right? I think that would be the more productive and constructive conversation to kind of go, well, what needs to be revised in these models, if anything, or what is a response to those kinds of more complex dynamical views of history and social evolution?
Yeah, it strikes me there's two issues around the models, and one is around their structure and the other is how people hold them. And around the structure, there's a lot of opportunity for new information to come forward, often sourced in outliers and particular details that allow us to challenge those models and or adjudicate between different models. The other problem, and this goes to what Brendan was saying, is like more of a pedagogical problem, which is even if we have good models, what people receive of those models is often much more simplistic and fragile than the models themselves. And that leads people to be in a position where they might hear a seemingly contrary piece of information and just throw the model out and think the models don't work anymore because what they understood of the model was very weak. It also leads to, the kind of classic genocidal dangers of people having a very simplistic version of a model and deploying it in a way that's atrocious for other people. So I think we need to be looking both at how these things challenge the model structure itself and also how they point out the difficulty in actually getting people to understand the richness of any model, especially models of developmental complexity. And how do we improve the models and make them less simple? It's got to be some kind of mix between necessary generalizing overviews, which is what human beings have to rely on, and this constant digging for new information in the variations and the particulars and the outliers, because that's where we're going to get the data that the overviews have to accommodate in order to be valid overviews. I would say to an earlier point, I'm not sure this book is opposed to meta narratives or generalizations. I think it's telling a developmental story in a specific way, and I think it might be part of the advancing edge of what the developmental community could call green if they wanted to. I think green is still young, it's still alive, it's still building itself up, and it's not necessarily the case that will always look like it is opposed to big pictures. I think it's putting together its best big picture, and we're seeing the leading edge of that. Another thing that popped up for me was it's very important to distinguish the difference between, say, linear and nonlinear from the difference between patterned and non-patterned, right? When we say something is not linear, we're meaning it doesn't have a very simplistic structure. That doesn't mean there's no sequences and even no dependent sequences. Doesn't mean there's no order or no patterning to it. It just means the range of patterning we're looking at can't be a simple number line or factory promotion model of what those things are, but it still leaves open a ton of room for there to be patterning and dependent sequences.
Yeah, I agree with all that. That's a good point about patterns versus linearity, and something to keep in mind. So probably a better use of language for me in thinking about these things is seeking the patterns to historical changes. Though a developmental pattern is of a certain structure, which one could argue has an element of linearity to it, even if that is a linearity that is complex and whatnot. I wanted to throw this in too, because of Layman, was something you said, which is very much the way that I look at this, which is that you can take this book as its own expression of an idea and engage with it individually. and try to see what sort of analysis it's providing. But you can also put this book into conversation with other books making different kinds of arguments to do a proper meta-analysis. And that is what I think would be helpful here. So while I do believe that this book skews in the direction of particularization and sort of a sort of a meta-narrative of no meta-narratives, or the law is no law account of things, I think that in the meta-analytical analysis that needs to be done, this is a very valuable resource in that broader project. It is an instance of particularity. Well, how do I put this? So in doing a meta-analysis, you also want to find in finding the abstractions or the patterns in the different analyses themselves, as it were. So this form needs to be brought into a meta-analytical account, I guess is what I'm getting at. And so I also don't in any way want to suggest that like this book is trash or anything like that. It's a very valuable and important book, even if primarily its value comes in an ecological context of other historical analyses that it can help sort of counterbalance. And I just wanted to make that point too. I'm curious, I'll just throw this out there. I think it would be a fascinating sort of experiment to ask meta-modernists or integralists to describe in 5 minutes, let's say, what their conception of, developmental models is. Because I wonder about the variability of how high or low resolution that would be expressed. And I think it would be really helpful, because when I think about these things, I tend to use a Wilber or a Gebser or someone who does have a lot of nuance and refinement and complexity in their articulation of an idea as sort of my base point of like, oh, when we're talking about these things, we're talking about this, which is why I'm often sort of taken aback and confused when people are saying stage theories are so unnuanced and highly linear and sort of, crude. And so I think that in that pedagogical sense that you're referring to, there is a distinction to be made between sort of the best presentation of the most complex and nuanced model versus how those get deployed and interpreted amongst, reception communities. So also something that's been very important, I think, to keep in mind that I need to do more so as I think about these things and have these conversations, is that we're not just dealing with, say, Wilber's model, we're dealing with everyone's conception of what Wilber's model might be. And that could be shockingly different if we were to actually do sort of that kind of an experiment and see how much of the nuance is retained in sort of how people would understand these things. So a lot of that's coming up for me in these conversations and I'd love to be able to do some work so that we can really home in on what are the true points of potential disagreement rather than where are we talking past each other.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and mention like some of the details of this text, which I think are worth going into, and if not here, then part of this emergent conversation. The critique of the indigenous critique of modernity is interesting, and it's the point where I've actually heard the most, for me anyway, understandable critiques by historians or specialists in the Enlightenment period, who push back on the book a little bit and say that it's a little bit overplayed how much the indigenous critique actually helped to shape modernity and the Enlightenment period. And I think that's fair, right? I think what they are doing is really advocating for indigenous voices and scholarship in this book, and I can understand why they're doing that. But I can also understand some of the pushback by historians who are saying this isn't exactly accurate, or there's a lot of interpretation with how influential particular texts or stories about, let's say, Kandiaronk, right? Kandiaronk had with Westerners, et cetera. So there's some conversation for debate in there, I think. Generally speaking, however, I do think that this conversation of indigenous scholarship, speaking back to modernity, is a good one. I think they've opened up a conversation that could be very productive and constructive. And as part of, as you're saying, as part of this larger ecology of the social turn toward indigenous voices right now, it's kind of something that is very contextually appropriate with everything going on politically and socially. the other possibility for us as sort of integral meta-modern oriented thinkers, and sort of just it's been on my mind recently, Lene Rachel Anderson's framing of these different epistemes, right? The indigenous, the pre-modern, modern, postmodern. And it really is, in this context on the indigenous critique, kind of bringing in these different voices to be in dialogue with these different epistemes, right? The book is really good at that. It's kind of saying even that the way we've divided these epistemes is probably more fluid than we imagined. And there's ways in which we might find these other stages or structures or centers of gravity or epistemes showing up in other cultures that we imagine that they weren't possible or didn't unfold yet, right? So again, there's more nuance and fluidity and complexity that I think it's doing there, and it opens up possibilities for us. And then in terms of the complex history and stadial theory, I mean, it's specifically, if we're going to be fair to the book and what they're arguing, they're really going after, admittedly, themes that have been addressed by, say, Wilber and Hanzi, right, about dominator hierarchy versus natural hierarchy. Both authors and scholars have critiqued 1800s stadial theory as sort of, you know, a bad form and bad approach, and there's more complexity to it. So that's certainly fair. And then the book is going after that, but it's also going after what is appropriately still a kind of popularized by Francis Fukuyama and Steven Pinker, et cetera, in sort of the general public discussion about how we moved from bands to tribes, et cetera. So they're really kind of saying like that doesn't exist, right? That there's actually much more complexity there. So how much Wilber, Hanzi, et cetera, want to address that and respond to it, or feel like they've already done it, is kind of an interesting question. The evolutionist models, I think, do require, even when we're looking at somebody like Wilber, who kind of creates the grand synthesis and says, okay, we moved up through these general stages, but there's a lot of complexity. That's the question of, well, how much complexification is of let's say the current research, the current paradigm, the emergent anthropology and archaeology, does it challenge it sufficiently to need to reimagine that general consensus? Or does that area need to be reworked in terms of how we imagine developmental logic unfolds? That's where I'm interested in. Like, that's the nuance, I think, that would be very intriguing to kind of unpack. The last thing would just be, in that spirit, I think the strongest evidence they're drawing from are anthropology and archaeology, in terms of what they talk about with seasonal dualism, social plasticity, and different forms of social experimentation that don't neatly striate or stratify as much as we imagined, even with our complex models. And that's sort of the claim I'm making. Like, the complexity of the models still have this striation, and that's exactly what I think the best evidence that Graeber and Wenger are drawing from are challenging. For us, it doesn't take away the possibility of the evolution of consciousness or the emergence of consciousness. But again, it challenges how we might imagine that actually unfolding, or how effective developmental logic is for being an accurate description of that process. So yeah, that's right here.
Yeah, I like a lot of that, Jeremy. I think there's some different approaches if we were to set ourselves the task of imagining a more adequate developmentalism. Right? And one of those approaches is, what if we were starting fresh right now with everything people currently know, rather than starting with what we knew in the 1990s or the 1950s or something like that? And it's really important to ask that question, because it might look very, very different if we started fresh with our full contemporary data set. Another question is, how do we think outside of the ideological enclosure of whatever we happen to be embedded in? Because even if you started now, if you were, say, let's just use the straw man of Steven Pinker. If you were Steven Pinker, you'd probably end up with a fairly linear liberal modernist success story, even if you started with all the contemporary data. So there's a challenge in this book, which is in some ways the classic postmodernist challenge, but it's to critique and think outside of the enclosure of modernity, and to ask ourselves to what degree the system that we're embedded in sets up the intuitions we have about what is a sensible reading of the data. And that's a really important question, because it may be that a huge number of problematic things are arising from the particular ideological enclosure that we're all currently sharing. And I think for me, I thought a lot about variations of modernity when I read this book, because one way from a integral meta modern kind of perspective, when you think about this indigenous critique of modernity, which is really very carefully spelled out, it's only some of the nations on the North American continent who engaged in this discourse with the Europeans and seem to be presenting a lot of the virtues that we think of as the virtues of the European Renaissance and Enlightenment. And so that opens up the possibility that those nations are themselves a form of modernity, that they're people who are acting from the values we associate with modernity and may well be developmentally on the far side of something like the dogmatic kingdom agrarian cultures that we look back on and think we're on the far side of now. Right. So was there a North American modernity? Was there a dozen other kinds of modernity coming and going at different phases that we could learn from and help negotiate the situation that we're in, rather than imagining that the form of modernity we have is the destiny of history and a trap we can't get out of except for incrementalist tinkering?
Yeah, just to add one caveat with that too, and in a total agreement, Layman, the useful thing about this book and a lot of the research that this book is aggregating is really kind of going, okay, so the alleged things that only Western Enlightenment did, we find variations or versions of those in other cultures. So it almost fractalizes this developmental map and almost regionally locates it and situates it in more, again, regional histories that are more specific, more contextual, and say, okay, so they had their own kind of version of modernity, and they used it differently. It doesn't necessarily remove the possibility that these are forms of emergence of social complexity in societies, but it kind of relativizes and pluralizes or decenters the way those emerge and the novel kind of forms of combination that they do emerge, right? So then we can have a much more pluralistic conversation about emergence, right? That doesn't narrativize or centralize necessarily Western Enlightenment. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think all that's really helpful and important too. One of the things that I think this book does a really good job of, in terms of genuinely, I think, undermining a premise of at least the Wilberian model, is the tying of development to modes of production. And I talked about this in one of the reviews I made, but being able to separate those two, I think, is really important. And one thing I think that we need to keep in mind, as if we are setting, if folks are interested in pursuing the task of trying to more adequately refine developmental models, I think one thing that needs to be better parsed is the separation of technology from cultural development. I mean, the notion that sort of modernity is inextricably linked to industrialization could be a great avenue of interrogation for the necessity of that, right? Because if we just assume that association, then we assume that, oh yes, you know, as you advance into formal operational thinking, then your mind will become more empirical and scientific, and you'll make industrialized things, and you know that's inevitable. But it's, I think, one of the things that was really important to point out in this book that they do is that there were indigenous communities with you know, all the rhetorical, argumentative, back and forth, reasoned debate going on, and that's happening in the absence of, you know, all the trappings of European industrialized modernization. So I think, to Layman's point, there are localized forms of modernization, and this ties in, I think, with a point that Zach Stein makes, which is that you can separate development, sort of cognitive development, from skill capacity, and you can unequivocally see that there are asymmetric capacities between these two emerging, whatever you want to call them, blocks or civilizations, right? And to the point where, you know, intense high tech kinetic warfare is something that the Europeans are bringing as a capacity into not the conversation, but into the situation, where there is an asymmetric quality that leads to, you know, the way that, you know, the genocidal basically path unfolded in the Americas, right? And so to be able to differentiate the ways that sort of cognitive skills can be applied to certain kinds of technological development, I think is important, because arguably, and I think this could be a really interesting and fruitful area of exploration for where a lot of overlap could be found, and some synthesis here, is that I think arguably the civilization that meta-modernists are trying to build is a lot more like indigenous society than it is like anything, you know, going on in some cyberpunk dystopian hyper-modernist, you know, world, right? Where there is deeper connection with the earth and with spirituality and with community, et cetera, et cetera. And we would view that as development, right? But there's a sort of kind of eschewing of certain kinds of modes of production, certain kinds of technologies, or at least a better way of harmonizing these that is possible. And I think that these are ways of thinking about these sorts of models that could be more fruitful, you know, rather than kind of bifurcating into you know, a kind of either or about these sorts of things. So those are some thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, Ryan, I don't know if you wanted to jump in, but just in agreement there, in resonance. Generally speaking, I think the association with again, the Industrial Revolution and runaway technology and technological complexity and secularity, like that those have to come together with modernity, is what's really being challenged by all of this evidence. So, and as you said, Zach Stein mentions this as well, that there are forms of development, like we are developing, but it's a sort of runaway asymmetric form where, okay, we have high complexification of technology, runaway economic technologies in the form of industrial globalized capitalism, et cetera. Certainly those have complexified, but there may be other forms or other ways in which complexification happens, right? So the morphology or the shape of consciousness evolution is probably much more pluralistic, with different variations of complexification, things going one way or another way, or combining in different forms this way and going in a different form this way. So again, the shape is there, right? The patterning that we like to look at is certainly there, but just the kind of processual and complex dynamical realities of these histories are far more localized and specific. And then again, I think, you know, that potentially can deepen and make more robust the models. And then the general principles and conclusions we draw from those patternings might be a bit different. So yeah, I'll pause there. I don't know, Ryan, if you wanted to jump in or keep on.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something that you were saying, Brendan, a couple things actually, right? And one is the notion that, and we see this all too often in today's culture wars, right? That one side, or the side making the critique, is actually strawmanning the thing it's critiquing and committing the strawman fallacy, right? Where you're debunking claims that, or perspectives or positions people don't in reality hold, or at least it doesn't capture the nuance of how people are actually thinking about it. And then claiming to present the alternative perspective, which is not actually debunking, because it's just debunking a straw man, right? And so I want to have a conversation about like what more specifically, what do you think were some straw mans made in that book, right? Whether it's of Pinker, of the more classical, you know, Western developmental civilizational perspective. And I know you talked about these in some of your articles, and kind of wanted to see, you know, if there was any pushback or disagreement or agreement with what you felt like the Davids might have been straw manning.
That's a really good question. Thanks. So I mean, I write the word strawman in the margins every few pages in here. Example would be, you know, he says, or they say, well, you know, people used to think that basically there was just this 200,000 year period where not much was happening. And now we know that that's not the case at all, and things are much more interesting. And it's sort of like, okay, you set that up as there was this stupid, you know, simplistic way of thinking about it, but now you're presenting this sort of nuanced alternative. But it's like, who's saying that nothing happened in 200,000 years of human evolution? It's like you're shadow boxing with you know, you're setting yourself up to make a claim that, you know, I think certainly no anthropologists or archaeologists would say nothing was happening in that period. And things like that occur throughout. I mean, if you want, I could try to draw up a couple of lists at some point that might be helpful. And I think that, again, similarly, the whole developmental issue is sort of very much framed as a well, we now know, because these things can occur in different forms than hitherto was part of the main archaeological anthropological discussion, that we can show that basically the whole linear model of, you know, linear progression through stages is not true. And it's like, well, but no one, I mean, I shouldn't say no one, right? Certain, I guess people are saying that, but no one in the conversation who's genuinely engaging with these ideas in a deep way, in the way that I would think most of folks in the community would suggest that more or less Wilber, Gebser, other thinkers are doing. It's just sort of like, well, no one's saying that it's a clear this and that we can account for all these different other ways of thinking about things, still with the basic pattern framing of some kind of a developmental schema. Another thing I'll say is that they'll leave out information, so like this very important idea of seasonality, going back and forth, changing of hierarchies. Well, there's no mention of like the climate and how the climate sort of makes its demands that enforces certain kinds of seasonal shifts, right? And that once the introduction of the Holocene occurs and there's sort of a stable climatological epoch, then you see a certain kind of sustained pattern that occurs in a certain way, and that couldn't have been possible in the kind of vast climatological fluctuations. So there's sort of there's an ignoring of other variables and factors that could do a great deal of explanatory power, but are not brought into the conversation. I suppose this technically wouldn't necessarily be classed as straw manning. It's more just sort of well, but it is though. I mean, it also is. I think they straw man the idea of egalitarian societies, right, by ignoring information about immediate return hunter-gatherer forager societies and just basically ignore a whole swath of anthropological literature. So it's like, to tie this all back in, there's a narrative that they're trying to present for various reasons, and they're leaving out a lot of contextualizing information that could actually further complexify their complexification, but they're sort of forcing their complexification into too simplistic a schema. So those would be some examples, but again, I could present a whole list, and I did so in a couple instances with Pinker and Mircea Eliade and other thinkers. But yeah, when you see that happening throughout so frequently, it leads to a sort of like, okay, I've got to take everything here with a grain of salt. I've got to view this, kind of peel off the layers of certain kinds of rhetorical flourishes that maybe don't land. I've got to do all this work just to kind of get to the kernels of the good stuff, which is in there in various parts of the book, but that's a problematic element about the book for me.
I don't disagree with any of that, but there's some factors for me that mitigate my response to it, is what I found. Like I was saying at the beginning, this is not the big integral historiography, and we need one, and it would have to be more along the lines of the parameters you're suggesting. And this book is deliberately, I think, 3 different things, and only one of those things is a history book. So there's always going to be some undermining of that aspect of it to do the political presentation and to do the philosophical conclusion drawing parts. So I give them some credit, some leeway in that respect. I'm so used to reading Nietzsche that when someone refers to someone else negatively, I assume it might still be a positive. If Nietzsche says someone's ignorant and malicious, you'll find another book where he praises ignorance and maliciousness. So it's important not to assume we know what people mean by apparently dismissive statements, especially in a culture where we're all kind of hardwired now to be really jumpy and critical of potential negative implications. I did, like I mentioned on with Jeremy the other day, I listened to this as an audiobook rather than reading it. And I think that might cause some of those things that you're picking up on, Brendan, seem more like colloquial, just rhetorical flourishes to speech, as if I was having a conversation with someone. Whereas if I was visually zeroing in on the text, I might go, yeah, that could be a flaw. I do think that they have a kind of tendency to point to missing information that they want to fill in as being suspiciously missing, right? And go, well, it's almost as if they're saying nothing was happening. Well, that's a good lead into starting to more richly explore the textures of what was happening that we don't normally take into account. But it's not necessarily the case that people were dismissing anything that was going on. It's like someone saying, just because they don't see something in the media, why aren't they talking about this? Why are they holding it back from me? So I am a little bit wary of that kind of social and ecological suspiciousness imputed upon gaps of information. But generally, I'm pretty okay with the way they did it because of the way that I expect this book to be communicating, which is only 1/3 a history text.
Yeah, I would just throw in a few things there too. I think with those kind of rhetorical flourishes about, okay, why isn't anybody talking about this, or nothing happened for 100,000 years? Why do we believe that? As a general, as a book of public intellectual work, right? They're addressing the public and the kind of general myths that the public assumes or presumes that are in our media. Just speaking, let's say, of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where literally there's the bone, the Australopithecus hitting the bone, and then it flies up, and then we skip all of that stuff and get to civilization and tool making. That's the interesting thing. When we started making tools, when we started building, monumental centers, then things really picked up. I do think that as a general mythological tendency, that is the kind of cultural attitude. So I kind of took those forms of statements generally with that kind of attitude in mind, or who they were speaking to and who their readership and audience is. I'll just bring up a few things too. I found it interesting because I've been following their essays and writing about this, and the book doesn't bring in some of the nuances that their previous academic writing, when they were writing for an academic audience, does bring in terms of some of that nuance. So Brendan was mentioning, the climatological context of the last glacial maximum, right? Kind of helping that seasonal dualism really contrast the different forms of social organization. They bring that right up immediately, and they're drawing from the different anthropologists who talk about the climatological, environmental factors that helped kind of produce that seasonal dualism or seasonal morphology. So they're aware of this, but I find it interesting that they don't necessarily bring it into the text as explicitly as they do in some of their earlier academic works when they're actually kind of building the arguments. Generally speaking, things like, James C. Scott's work on egalitarian cities during the 3,000 or 4,000 year period that we were only really beginning to learn about was also sort of predicated on Anthropocene changes, right? Climatological changes. Why did we shift into centering on agriculture in cities? What kind of shifts in the Mediterranean climate we're kind of promoting that or assisting that, and these as a kind of open debate that anthropologists are always arguing about, how much does this factor in versus not. And then there's that other interesting thing where there's some evidence that the Holocene was already well and started when these egalitarian multi-subsistence cities were already in effect for thousands of years. So there's contrary evidence back and forth, and there's nuance in there. I don't know if it's always explicitly stated in Dawn of Everything, which again, kind of, who is this book written for? It's a sort of a general public discussion book. And I mean, my goal anyway is to kind of dig into the academic debates and try to draw from that to add some of this nuance that we're talking about here, and not end up strawmanning Graeber and Wengrow, but maybe they don't help themselves by not putting those arguments into this text. So
I think it's a really important question to ask: who is this book for? Who's the ideal audience for this book, or the presumed audience? And I think that's a good point. It is popular history in some sense, not in a pejorative sense, but it is aimed at a mass audience, not a highly specialized sort of academic audience. I think there is also, though, I think the ideal audience is an ideologically defined demographic as well. I think that, again, it'll be best used in an ecology of other analyses, but I think there's a part of the reason why I feel some anxiety about the reception of the work is because I feel precisely that it will be misunderstood for I'm trying to think of a good way of putting this. It's not too simplistic. I'm worried that people will think this book is something than what it is kind of my concern. I think Lehman is right. It's sort of 3 books doing 3 different things, and a big part of that is a sort of philosophical history. I think that some people will think it's just a history book, and because it's a big one and it's got a lot of footnotes, and because it's a lot of conversation about it, there's a concern that I have that it'll be just sort of an easy, this is the history then, and not be taken into a broader context of other ideas. So that there's a reason why it's sort of like because here's my point, and to bring in this ideology issue, my concern is not that the book is ideological. My concern is that the people will be interacting with the ideology in a way that they sort of take up the purely factual line of argumentation because of that it's sort of like it appeals very much to what we believe or certain, ways of looking at the world. It sort of conforms well to, let's say. And so then there's sort of, okay, well, everything that they're saying seems to be in line with how I would like things to be. So this must all be true. But I want to throw into this that there are some great critiques of this book from the left. There's a fantastic YouTube channel called What is Politics, who there's the host is deeply versed in the anthropological literature, and just they go after Wengrow and Graeber for basically ignoring huge swaths of the anthropological literature. And it's not coming out of an ideological disagreement that, oh, if people think this is true, then my leftist ideas won't be taken up into society and implemented. It's precisely, actually, it's like, oh no, people are going to think because this is a leftist history that these must be the facts. And first and foremost, I just feel that whatever nuancing and complexification and enriching of our narratives needs to occur, whatever that looks like, I think should be in dialogue with the best facts and the best analyses and the richest and most nuanced ideas. And I worry that because this skews in a certain way and is doing more things than just a history, that people will misunderstand how this work fits into the broader literature on these topics. So there's this bunch of different ideas I just kind of came together there, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll just throw in. I did watch the video blogger in question, and I had some problems with how they were framing. I think they were strawmanning Graeber and Wengrow quite a bit, unfortunately, because I've read all the texts that they were reading and how they're interpreting. So I don't know. I would question how much they're ignoring, and then how much emphasizing, let's say, anarcho-primitivist scientists, let's say in anthropology, et cetera, that field wasn't being ignored. It wasn't really their emphasis, right? Because they're looking more at, let's say, social ranking and inequality in the Paleolithic and what that had to say about how societies weren't necessarily one or the other. I know Graeber has been critiqued for not taking the anarcho-primitivist or anarcho-communist field as explicitly, being a leftist. Why isn't he doing that? But there's nuance in there. So, I mean, this is the problem. We can take this all the way down, and even in the intra-left debates and criticism, I didn't find that a very convincing counter argument. Although, again, because of some of those issues of straw manning and et cetera, but not that that can't happen, not that there can't be a good leftist critique of Graeber and Wengrow's book and where they're coming from. And I think there's some ultimate problems with, in the ecological side of things, like, and this is something that Matteo was bringing up in our conversations as well. Ultimately, what are we going to do with cities? And our cities ultimately going to drive a kind of coercive direction towards statehood, et cetera. So those are the kind of interesting things that I do think the author did bring up, the YouTuber did bring up.
Yeah, just before we lose this thread, because I really think it's important. What I loved about that blogger's analysis was taking a materialist approach, which isn't to say a reductive, everything goes back to material, but that basically we cannot ignore material conditions if we want to achieve political change in a way that is, an improvement on our current situation. So one of my fundamental critiques with this book is that they don't see it that way at all, and they reduce basically everything's volitional. It's like, why did all these different things happen? Well, people chose to do different things, and that fits in with their sort of ideological skew. But what I loved about that other analysis was like, well, wait a second, we need to deal with, what's the material substrate? Because if we go to try to fix problems and we don't change the material conditions, we're just going to recreate them again, right? And so for me, it's so crucial that if we are interested in progressive change, even radical progressive or leftist change, then we can't ignore, you know, the environmental factors and the big forces of history. We ignore them to our peril. And I think that that's the main critique of the left that I've seen from this, is that if we put everything about choice, we just ignore all these monumental influences, that those are the things we kind of need to come to terms with. So
yeah, there's two things that are really interesting to me about the way Brendan is coming at this, and also the way Brendan's lensing the What Is Politics guy. One is this question of something being ignored. Like, this goes back to what I was saying, about like, what are they keeping from us, sort of thing. Is it being ignored, or does it just happen to not be in this particular text? Like, what obviously everybody's doing a lot of things that aren't in every condition, and when we're trying to get an overall picture, we're often going to be kind of frustrated by the fact that they didn't bring in more material conditions, or where's the analysis of communication technologies, where's the analysis of energy production, where's the ecological framing. And they might be in other places, or they might not be in other places, but there's something peculiar, I think, about humanity today, where we always sort of are concerned about what isn't in a particular example. And that gets me to the worry Brendan was talking about this being, the form of this content might be misleading to people. And I find that really interesting, because it's something that we need to explore more deeply in the culture at the moment, which is, there's a very strong sense that we have to be careful about the sources of information, about platforming them, or making sure they're fact checked, or, how do we make sure the output of information is important and held coherently and sensibly and isn't problematic. And I appreciate those concerns, but temperamentally, I focus more on the other side, which is, how do we make the receivers of information more responsible and less diluted? How do we make them better able to assimilate? How do we make them assume in advance that all information will be misleading them, and handle that to some degree? So I'm not as worried as Brendan is, but I appreciate that set of concerns. And I think those two have to be in dialogue with each other, which is, what's our responsibility as recipients of the information, and what are their responsibilities as outputters of a certain form of information? One thing just pops into my mind was a thing Jon Stewart did on The Daily Show years ago, talking about someone opens up Tale of Two Cities. They read it was the best of times. They put the book down and they start denouncing Charles Dickens for ignoring all of these important, terrible conditions about the 19th century, right? So there's a sense of, how are we responding to the incompleteness of information in general? Maybe Jeremy has something to say, but I also wanted to check in with Ryan, because how are you doing on time, Ryan? Are we talking about what you want to talk about? I would almost want to start diving into some of the more detailed things that are actually in the book, which is what I find fascinating, is what are their actual observations and conclusions, apart from our general sense of the framing and its effect on people. But maybe that's where you want to go, or I just want to check in.
Great. I'm good to go for however long. I might need to take a bathroom break here or there, but yeah, however long you guys can go for. But yeah, I agree, Layman, with that direction that you propose. I think it'd be a good time to dive into some of the granularities and evidentiary claims presented in the book. But Jeremy, I think you had a response to Brendan about the YouTube video.
Oh, just generally speaking, I think, and this is the issue, I think, with a book of popular readership. The challenges, I think, are how much information do we bring up front? Because I do think they're very interested in the material dimensions of how we creatively shape and reshape ourselves. I think that's a big part of how they created the foundations of this text through their earlier essay writing that, again, was much more academic. But that's very much just woven into the entire conversation in terms of climate, environment, resources, and even in the kind of framing of seasonal dualism. They're drawing from Olga Soffer's work, who have just begun to dip into, but essentially looking at kind of aggregation and choke points of seasonal flora and fauna and fisheries, et cetera, and why people came together in such a large population, or what geographically these kinds of extended confederations of hunter-gatherer societies look like, and how that politic was possible. And let's say the upper glacial maximum, they're drawing from all of those things to talk about seasonal dualism. And even when they're bringing up ethnographic studies that are more contemporary, that those are sort of factors that are drawn in. But to be fair to what your point is, and I think it's a valid concern from the left, is how much are we going to overemphasize in a particular text volition and choice, right? And underemphasize the material conditions that are always a part of that. And I do think that maybe as Layman was saying, a philosophical or I don't know, stylistic or literary choice, they decide to emphasize decision, choice, creativity, the human capacity to make that. And I think in an effort to be non-reductive about that capacity, because they tend to, part of their critique in this text, but then also in the earlier work, has been this sort of overemphasis on the material conditions as the driving force for human creativity. And they're kind of saying, well, no, we have creative responses to the material world, which they want to emphasize. But perhaps I think that might obfuscate their actual grounding in being very aware of the material conditions of either the Upper Paleolithic or hunter-gatherer society from 100 years ago, et cetera.
Yeah, I want to add one thing about the volition. And obviously, if we were doing a classic Wilberian take, we would want to balance that out with sources of information and causes from all the quadrants. But I think one of the things they're doing, and you're right, they emphasize volition quite a bit. I think they're leaning into the possibility, which they think is underserved in general history, that most of the functions that we associate with contemporary human beings have been present and active in human beings all along, right? So that it's not just that we've recently become volitional people who can wonder about how we should run society. They want to say that we've probably drastically underestimated the degree to which that was present over the entire spectrum of sapient history.
Yeah, well, and to that point, I think it's a needed corrective. It's just one that I feel like would be best presented in balance, right? In the same way that I'm a human being and I have volition, I think, determinists, I don't, but I feel that way, but I also don't have total control over everything. I am bounded by constraints of my environment, and I can hold those two things at the same time and appreciate that my volition plays out within a set of constraints. I feel like this is where their ideology hurts their analysis most, is that they don't take into account, I shouldn't say they don't take them into account, they explain them either away or they ignore them or what have you. There's a number of things that they do with the kind of coercive set of constraints that humanity also deals with, that they sort of separate from their analysis in order to emphasize volition. And for me, well, this is where the whole notion of developmental progression gets lost, is because it's like they view it as a straitjacket, the notion that there could be any kind of higher order sorts of strange attractors that might be influencing certain things in a kind of law-like quality. That to them is like, no, if you're focusing on volition, we should, and it's a wonderful thought experiment, and that's the sort of a thing too. Like if this book were called A Thought Experiment of the Possibilities of Human Volition in Ancient Prehistory, like perfect, but it's not quite presented that way. But I think you're right. I mean, they also do consider a lot of the material factors. I just feel that there's a way of properly balancing those two. Because I also hate reductionist history and material reductionist history. Like, oh, well, why did the Renaissance happen? Well, because the Medicis had a lot of money or something. Or you get these sort of like kind of what that Marxian in the final analysis, sort of everything comes down to money in exchange of those sorts of things. And I think that there's a healthy medium to be found there. I don't think this book does it, but again, in the broader ecology of analyses, it provides something that skews towards volition, and that's a crucial thing to be considering when we're doing these reconstructions too. I would also just want to say this as well. I think it's really important. I think that one of the biggest concerns, and a crucial and important one, is that developmental narratives and stage theories are sort of they certainly have the propensity to infantilize indigenous communities and indigenous societies. Like, oh, they were at the dawn of humanity, and so they were more like children or something, and they didn't have all of the cognitive capacities that us modern Westerners do or something, right? And I think that that needs to be completely blown out of the water. And this book does do a good job of showing that that you can't, that's ridiculous, right? So being able to appreciate that 100,000 years ago, the full scale of, you know, hierarchical complexity was available to any given person in a given community is crucial, I think. And it's also just borne out by the evidence in our biological, you know, it's all there, right? So that needs to be a big part in how we refine developmental stage theory models about human history. I do think that then that a really important thing comes into the mix here, which needs to be nuanced, and it's been occupying a lot of my thought, is sort of, well, how do certain contextual societal organizations influence what winds up being maybe the aggregate level of hierarchical complexity in the society, and how does that play out in relation to its particular technologies? And then this is where that technological and capacity and skill issue comes back in, which becomes very fraught. And I think that within that stew is where you could start to see the components of a real genuine you know, sort of developmental model that is taking into account a lot more of these nuances than just, oh, you know, archaic societies were, you know, primary thinkers or something, you know, like too simplistic. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think those are good framings. Essentially, what it comes down to for me here in thinking about the big picture and what this means for developmental maps, I don't think it necessarily throws things out, but what it does do, and what this new paradigm, I mean, it's not just them, and they're part of this new, maybe they're one of the first to try to popularize the new history as we understand it. James C. Scott is another one who's written about this, and I'm sure there's going to be more texts in the near future. But what I think it does do, it relativizes the development of civilizations, right? Of states, of agrarian societies as maybe one unfolding directionality of complexity, but not one that is totalizing or universal. And then it pluralizes in terms of saying, well, okay, indigenous societies or hunter-forager societies or ones that were both had their own forms of complexity that probably had their own developmental trajectories in terms of, you know, their own directionalities. So it really just decenters the whole image or patterning that we have, and it kind of pluralizes it across very different forms and variations, and it doesn't centralize civilization. But here's the interesting thing, like this is the argument, should it centralize civilization? Is civilization genuinely some kind of genuine meta next step that people are doing? And if it is, in what way? And I think for me anyway, in terms of my own theoretical framing of this, it differentiates the whole trajectory of civilization as one form of complexification and shows that there are others, and really a kind of integration or a coherence across these different forms of social complexity and evolution is one that kind of holds them all together. But it doesn't need to do so in terms of seeing civilization or the emergence of civilization as a sort of a necessary universal next stage for humanity. And I do think it comes down to that sort of question and debate. Is this a genuine next phase for all of us? Or is it one direction that, again, environmental, social, cultural, consciousness factors decided to go down, and it complexified and it became runaway, right? But that there's other complementary forms of complexification that also exist. And if those two also exist, then where does it put us now in this planetary context where there is a lot of emphasis, particularly in the contemporary scholarship, Tyson Yunkaporta, Robin Wall Kimmerer, in more popular terms, of saying, well, hey, you know, maybe the domestication of agriculture is one form of working with the environment, but controlled fires, right, that indigenous and nomadic cultures have used for since the Paleolithic, at the very least, probably earlier, if we're going to go back into hominids, had some form of way of shaping our environments and our bioregions, right? So that kind of takes or complexifies or decenters the technological narrative that only here do we get that form of complexity. So what does civilization afford, right? What differentiation does it afford? And is it necessarily a next step, or is it just one form of variation and differentiation in a larger array of different complexities that might converge in a kind of planetary or integral or meta modern, right? What happens when we bring them all together? Then I think we get some interesting questions about development, integration, and we get different analogs from nature, like symbiogenesis with like Lynn Margulis and that kind of metaphor, right? We have kind of differentiation of different organelles that sort of come together and create something, but not necessarily any kind of clear sense of, we might not even call it development until everything kind of coheres into a working organism. So I guess to wrap up, I guess my question would be, can we call it development until we do that? You know that famous Gandhi phrase, that's Western civilization. They asked what he thought about it. And he said, oh, I think that'd be a good idea. Like, well, maybe development would be a good idea if this can all somehow cohere, if these different forms of differentiation and complexification actually cohere. So yeah, I think it relativizes and decenters that. And then we have that question of, well, can development emerge here? And that's sort of how I've been playing with some of these ideas in my own work.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. And I feel like in some ways this has been helpful to sort of help situate where the conversation could go. I don't mean this conversation, but this broader conversation. I think of exploring these different avenues for trying to integrate this information and integrate the complexification of these models. And I think that when you're working at that, how do I put this? Well, yeah, just that I feel like some very rich avenues for consideration might play out in different ways of different explanatory ways of sort of modeling effectively, that's still broadly developmental, even as it's a lot more nuanced by the ideas. So it would be an interesting thing to kind of maybe try to hone those a bit. I know I'm going to be doing that over the next however long, and then maybe bring that back into some conversation to see what benefits or what merits or demerits either sort of approach has to trying to best integrate these sorts of ideas. But I'm keen to dig into some of the granular evidence, and general ideas here in the book, if we wanted to go to the text, as they say, if anyone wanted to do that.
Yeah, well, I'll just make a couple of comments and then maybe talk about the things in this book that I enjoyed the most. First is I really like the way Jeremy is talking about these pluralistic cohering that would give us the basis for a new way of thinking about, or even a first real way of thinking about actual development. Because a lot of the time I have this idea in my mind that we still basically imagine the world as kind of a flat plane and there's a single vertical axis that goes up. But really we're dealing with some kind of planetary sphere where up can be all these different directions simultaneously, right? You could have an equally high altitude in what appears to be exactly the opposite direction of someone else's progress. And it's really important for us to keep that omnidirectionality in mind when we're thinking about what these things are, because they're much more like organic layers, right? They're altitudes of cycles and variations that are ebbing and flowing and fissuring and converging and cross-pollinating, and that's all what has to cohere. And it's really important to make sure on our journey to try to find what those are, that we don't consciously or unconsciously compressed down to this notion of a single vertical axis. So that's one of the dangers. But what did I love in the book? I love the concept of schismogenesis. That really is stayed in my mind. I love, like Jeremy was talking about, the seasonal modes and the sense that you're no one and no civilization is ever in a particular mode, but there are circumstantial oscillations that they go through. And that because of these, a lot of our ancestors may have had a more sincerely ironic or serious playful relationship to civilization than we do, because they passed in and out of it. It wasn't as binding. Because they had that freedom to move, they also had the freedom to decide whether they wanted to obey the structures in that system. And they had some conceptual space if they wanted to rethink that system. I think philosophically, this breakdown of three basic kinds of freedom and three basic kinds of oppression is a really interesting contribution of this book. their analysis of statehood arising in the exapted domestic role of the meta-tribal patriarch who combines care with violence. That's a very interesting reading. A lot of the time in this book, they come back to the fact that inequalities in wealth and resources don't necessarily have to become fixed hierarchical inequalities in how society gets patterned. That requires an extra step, so that when we're looking at inequality, we haven't laid our hands on the problem. It requires inequality to be translated into some kind of fixed power over what the social patterns are. And that wasn't always the case. And there might then be ways for us to undo that in our current system. And just what I mentioned earlier, just the cross-pollinization of cultures, the way that, even if we don't say we sourced the European Enlightenment entirely in the positions of North American indigenous nations, we have to be thinking of ways that we don't normally consider, which are cultures created each other in various ways. And they ran into things they could recognize in each other and uptook things from each other insofar as they could recognize that. And nobody's got a single cultural trajectory. That even if you buy the European story, they didn't do it on their own. They're a part of a community that was co-doing it from all kinds of different directions. And I think that's a really important piece of the story.
Yeah, I'll just throw Ryan, did you want to jump in? Actually, then okay. Yeah, I love the emphasis on the schismogenesis, particularly the chapter on the different Canadian and Californian communities that, in seeing their Canadian neighbors with a kind of very hierarchical structure of society, decided very much to kind of do the opposite. We might even imagine, I don't know if this is particularly the case, but the Tlaxcalans as another example, really having this sort of democratic relationship with authority, and then kind of in some ways publicly flogging their leaders to make sure that they were kind of in step with, actually being democratic, and punishing them if they didn't, with their big neighbors, the big bullies of, the Aztecs being right next to them. So there is a really interesting way in which relationality kind of shows up again and again throughout all these different examples they bring up. The careful attention of Neolithic communities, various examples of sort of avoiding agriculture or moving away from it, actually trying it for a bit and kind of pushing back off of it. The Cahokian chapter is quite an interesting one too, in terms of how it was kind of avoided after that point, after the Cahokian civilization. So again, yeah, the relationality really came forward for me, and those are some of my favorite parts of the text as well. I already mentioned the seasonal dualism thing. They bring this up more in some of their earlier work, but they talk about the possible role, and Layman, you and I talked about this, the possible role that seasonal dualism assisted in kind of this dispersal and aggregation contrast, right? It's a very kind of meta, as you're saying, there's almost a meta-modern oscillation in that seasonal dualism, which I found so interesting. And it made me kind of quip with a note saying, well, hey, maybe they were the original meta-modernists because they got that kind of oscillation. But my point is, they bring up an interesting hypothesis, and I don't think they develop it too much in this text, about how cultural efflorescence or behavioral modernity may have, the conditions for that emergence may have been with this highly contrasted seasonal dualism of kind of moving back and forth between very different forms of social organization, and having a very, therefore having a very conscious awareness of how identity, power, authority, and then of course time in terms of that rhythmicity are all kind of playing out, and created these sort of very fecund conditions for the emergence of behavioral modernity and symbolic thinking, et cetera. It's just their hypothesis they throw out, but I kind of intuitively found that to be very interesting, because it sort of points to oscillation as this really important precondition for the emergence of culture. That relationality, whether you're talking about schismogenesis or you're talking about seasonal dualism and the contrast of social organization, that relationality between, that contrast between kind of creates this very interesting, creative and dynamic culture, right? That's very individuated in some sense or another. So that was really interesting for me, and it got me really thinking about how that might apply for us today as we're talking about oscillation in the modern, postmodern context. And then something I'm writing about in my book is sort of seeing perhaps this larger arc of oscillation between civilization and its complexity, and generally what we're talking about with sort of indigenous complexity, and what happens in this process of becoming planetary as we're really beginning to look or imagine the future in a much more bioregional and indigenous oriented way, or at least learning from it. Like what happens in an oscillation back to reintegrating those perspectives. I think there's this, if the hypothesis is correct, there's a very fascinating possibility of a kind of planetary trans-individuation, which may be occurring for us at the moment in sort of the wider arc of this historical process. So yeah.
Gosh, so yeah, I guess if we're thinking about things that we liked a lot from the book and things that we learned of that we valued, I've already spoken about the decoupling of modes of production from sort of being a defining characteristic of what we might think of as some kind of stage of complexity. I think that that's one of the key takeaways for me, and an important one, and it sort of invites new ways of thinking about the whole thing, which is exciting. I think, yeah, there's a strong thrust of the book that is sort of deconstructive. It's trying to sort of rattle and shake up what you thought you knew, and there's also parts that are reconstructive, or at least productive. They're offering something, and I particularly enjoyed what they were offering. I tend to do that, I don't know, there's something about like we can take things apart all day, but I get most excited when people try to start putting things back together and sort of offering something. And their notion of the kind of triad of well, when they sort of deconstruct the state and what that really means, and then they propose an alternative model based around knowledge, force, and something like charisma, and that these two or these three things can kind of be coupled in certain ways, or found all together, or and to be able to look at the lens of societies through those particular categories and see what permutations are sort of possible, it was, I think, also like a fruitful avenue for kind of further consideration. In fact, actually, even viewing certain kinds of stage theory models through that lens can be really interesting too. I mean, when they were talking about these heroic societies that sort of formed on the marginal peripheries of urban centers, and sort of were hierarchical and all about glory, and there are ways of viewing that very much in the sort of imperial epic kind of red this and that. And I don't know, there's an avenue to explore potential ways that, oh, maybe either we can see that what the stage theories we're getting at can be better explained by the Graeber Wengrow model, or vice versa. Maybe what they're saying can be better explained by. Anyway, so that was an interesting element. Generally speaking, though, I think the main thrust of the book, so long as it isn't, if you can peel away the overstatements, I think is really important, which is that there's a great deal of complexity, and that the notion that different things are happening in different ways in the record, that you find forager monumentality is a fascinating idea, that you don't need a fixed agricultural base to be doing all sorts of monumental public works and great levels of complexity. All those contributions really help nuance any potentially simplistic sense that things just sort of grew, and then, of course, you got the agriculture. It's interesting too, I think, as this stuff is brought up a lot for me. I love to garden. I think of sort of my vision of, the Shire really is sort of my paradisal framing of things, but it's a very agricultural kind of ideal, right? And it's interesting to think about other sort of ideals, particularly when you're talking about immediate return, egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, where you really are able to have equality, essentially. Now, this isn't their point. This is more the point that's coming from the critique that I've been kind of going down that rabbit hole of. But to think about that as an ideal form, where actually agriculture is this imposition, it's this drudgery, it's this, it's a different lens that I don't tend to think about. Yeah, so I'll just say that. So those are a few things. There were some nuances that they added to sort of the Mesopotamian civilizational expansion, which I thought were interesting. And then as far as the schismogenesis thing, I think that's also very important. I guess that goes back to Gregory Bateson originally, I think, in terms of he coined the phrase, but that's certainly an anthropological thing that you see all the time. And it's very interesting. And it's a good word to have, because it helps solidify a concept that you see a lot happening. At least I do, that it's often those groups that we are closest to, whether, geographically, temporally, ideologically, what have you, that provide the most intense sort of friction and forcing of sort of going two different ways. You see that, a classic example is sort of the emergence of Christianity out of Judaism, and sort of the anti-Semitism that results as trying to emphasize, oh no, we're different. And so then that can be taken to sort of pathological extremes. So it's also a good word to have in terms of thinking about warnings and things to keep on your radar for how we define ourselves. It's also playing out arguably all over America right now. Oh, I'm not a Democrat, or I'm not a Republican, or what have you. So identity construction through negation, or through an othering, and all that. But again, that's not so much original to their work, though they do make good use of those ideas. So anyway, those are some of the things that really kind of resonated with me.
Schismogenesis intrigues me both philosophically, because I'm non-dualistically obsessed with same differences, and the idea that something has to be the same and has to be different, or the different enough to be same, is fascinating. But there's an interesting element there, which goes to the critique some people might offer. We mentioned it earlier, that this book doesn't lean heavily enough into the materialist basis of history, because schismogenesis supports this notion that we're a lot more playful and cultural than might otherwise be assumed. Because in schismogenesis, you might reject something that's pragmatic merely to have a different identity than someone who's too similar to you, right? And so that means that there's a whole drift of human history that is not driven by survival, materialism, pragmatics, right? And we understand that by just dealing with human beings in our own lives. They don't always do things that make sense. They're not always driven by practical forces of historical and material necessity. They try weird things out. They do things that seem to have no good reason. And I love that quirkiness and richness of the human character is brought into this, because if you don't really appreciate what human beings are like, you'll tell yourself a really truncated version of what history is, right? If you don't remember, like they do through the illustration of the Iroquois, that some people might choose to live their life on the basis of fulfilling dreams they had, right? If you don't at least have that in mind, which is backed up by all the kinds of weird people we know in our lives, then you're going to get a very weird, flattened reading of history. And that reading will contribute to a flattened, peculiar notion of what stages are, based on the insufficiency of your appreciation of what human nature is. So I really like that they're kind of forcing back into the conversation the full idiosyncrasy of what it is to be a human being. And one other thing, before you get to that, Graham, I wanted to mention the decoupling of stages of development and technology, which is really important. And it would be interesting as a project to see whether that works with Wilber's notion, because Wilber's notion is that technology is coupled to the stage that creates it only at the moment of creation. And after that, tools, concept, words are all available for anyone to use. They become immediately decoupled. So I wanted to bring that up too.
That's an interesting point. I just wanted to throw out the question for both of you, what you make of the kind of double-edged sword of the sort of corrective that retroactively sees the kind of full sweep of the potentials of a modern human in our, ancient ancestors. On first, gloss, it sort of immediately seems like, well, yes, of course, that's a very good thing. Otherwise we're dehumanizing or infantilizing, etc. So I definitely understand the reasons to do it, but I feel like there's another element that's also kind of dangerous, I think, potentially, because one of the great sort of postmodern insights was that people see the world differently, right? You know, depending on where you come from and what group you're a part of, and all sorts of factors, like the notion of the kind of modern you know, individual rational agent or something that from modernity is just like, well, no, people can see the world radically different based on the peculiarities of their context and where they're coming from. And so I see a potential danger in this sort of retroactive saying, oh, well, you know, people back then were every bit, at one point they say every bit as skeptical and critical thinkers as people today are. And that really stuck out to me. I'm like, I don't know, because in sort of retroactively seeing those characteristics of sort of postmodern or hypermodern society in these other societies, I feel like we're also kind of painting them with our own vices almost. Or at the very least, we're just doing a disservice to the idea that if we really want to appreciate difference based on context, then we kind of can't fully get away with just seeing our ancient ancestors as other versions of ourselves. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that that quandary.
Yeah, I think having a good balance between the two, I think, is important, because I realize what they're doing there by saying they're just like us, right? Graeber, in many of his works, brings up this theme of knocking down the walls between the past and the present, walls that were intended to keep the past at like an inferior stage or a childlike infantilized stage, right? I mean, we don't want to do that. So there is certainly important work, as you're saying, in kind of seeing the complexity of our ancestors or alternative modes of living, indigeneity, et cetera. But yeah, I think you're right in that the double side of that is how far are we going to modernize them, right? Because the conversation then ends up going both ways, as you're saying, that we might project a little bit too much about, you know, how we are today versus our ancestors. And I think this is probably what the, you know, I've seen this elsewhere, but the leftist critique of that is really kind of advocating for specifically egalitarian oriented societies and the importance of egalitarianism and human evolution. And so I think that they're advocating for, there are other ways of living that are very radically different that we don't quite get, right? Or are very estranged from us. And I think that's generally the indigenous critique too, right? Like that we get from indigenous scholars, that, hey, you know what, being kind of animistic and having a sort of cognition with place-based thinking and relationality in these different social arrangements is really good. And you guys aren't really familiar with that being, you know, in an organized state, et cetera. And I think those differences and contrasts are very important. I guess for me, it's kind of the danger is necessary to start teasing that out, right? Like when we take those walls down, those walls have to go down. And this is a new responsibility that I think we have to learn to individuate about in terms of, well, how are we different and how are we the same? And what does that look like? Certainly the danger is there, but I think the work is also there.
Yeah, that's a great question, Brendan. And, you know, for me, I think the reason we need to balance is we just don't know, right? We have to keep the possibilities in mind from both directions. I mentioned this when I was talking with Jeremy the other day on Clubhouse, which was, we can tell ourselves a story, as they sort of do in this book, which is that since human beings came online, we basically had all the fundamental human functions right away. That's what comes with this operating system. And because we haven't structurally changed very much, we can assume that people with brains like these can do all those things. That's a really important possibility. We need to take that very seriously. But we don't know for sure that they were the same as us, right? You get into the Julian Jaynes argument that the corpus callosum was different, or like I mentioned the other day, right? A 2% difference in the amount of the DMT in your brain would give you a radically different worldview. And that would not show up when we look at the skulls of the ancient dead. So we have no way of knowing if they were radically different or radically the same as us or somewhere in between. And so we have to hold all those spaces open because we simply don't know. But what we don't want to do is assume that we do and foreclose on the possibility that a huge amount of variation was present, and maybe more variation than we have at the moment, because there might be an argument saying healthy circumstances are ones in which people are more able to sample a broader pattern space. And those might be situations where our living style is more suited to our human physiology, or where we're less concerned about the artificial pressures of socialization, or where we're eating more different kinds of foods and have more bacteria in our body and are generally consuming more psychedelics, or any number of things that would say these people are seeing more of what we can be than most people today are. So it's not even the case that maybe they're as good as us. There maybe have been, and not all of them, right? There may have been unique, healthy situations, even very early on in human history, where they understood the range much better than we understand it today.
And doesn't that kind of bring us back to these big meta-modern integral generalist approach questions, which is, we're very comfortable asking those kinds of things. Why did we get stuck? Or if there was more plasticity in the past of social experimentation, what does this narrowing down afford us? And where is this going, right? Like, is this universally good? Do we want more of this? Or is there a return? What does the return look like in terms of integrating any of the gains of this particular narrowing down or specialization have afforded us, right? We might say our particular modernities with technology or landing rockets on the moon or having a kind of disconnection from land environment, the biome in our gut, like what has that afforded us as something that's processual and in relationship to that history and past. So I think, yeah, that's where the interesting questions really pop up.
Yeah, I think it's interesting and a little unnerving to see those questions, how much they're popping up in the culture wars, really. I mean, it's really interesting to think about if there's sort of a shared basis in the recognition that what we're doing right now is really unsustainable and probably, destined to imminent and terrible collapse of some kind. There's then that question of what we do about that. And a very common response is, as you say, do we return, and what does that look like? What to return to what, or how do we integrate these sorts of things? But that returning narrative is a very potent one. And it's one that you can see playing out. I would argue, and I'd throw this out there for, what your thoughts would be, but I mean, there's an uncomfortable way that I don't think when I throw this out, anyone will want to acknowledge that, but there's an uncomfortable way in which there's similarities, structural similarities to the answers being provided by both, indigenous complexity. We need to return to the land in a deep nature, connection with that, and, et cetera, and more nationalist articulations of return, of blood and soil and things like that. And of course, these things then interweave in really kind of terrifying ways, actually, when you get into these new age fascist, entities. But my point in saying this is that we're clearly recognizing that what's happening is broken, and there seems to be a universal response of we need to go back. So what do we go back to? And it seems like the nationalists, the white nationalists, and those folks, so they want to kind of go back to a certain time when that was, oh, well, that works, and I felt my connection with my group and my kin, and there's a sort of ideal there. But there's a going back, and that's going back to, well, maybe what we should have is hunter-gatherer societies and forager societies. I mean, look, they were egalitarian. Well, they disagree, but if you believe that they were egalitarian, then like that would seem to be a huge benefit, and they were sustainable. So I think there's a huge question here. I think it can be uncomfortable because politically, these are situated as sort of right and left, but my point would be that structurally they're actually somewhat similar. I mean, Wilber would call the retro-romantic argument of that whole Rousseauian move and everything as part of this. But my concern about the going back thing is really urgent, and it's because, well, one, I've had a taste with reactionaryism, and I've seen what that looks like. We've all seen it collectively, where this is playing out. And one of the promises of metamodernism to me is that it's not wanting to go back, it's wanting to go forward, but to do so in an integrative way that's bringing the best of these different backs into the future. And I get uncomfortable when, a work like this or others is sort of used to argue that, we need to go back to something. Again, whether that's a fair use or not of the work and all that, and the application issues that Layman and we were discussing are all there. But I wonder what you would make of this notion of the narrative of going back and what are we going back to versus the whole promise of developmental theory, which is that we don't have to go back, we can go forward with what was good about the past. Yeah.
Yeah, these are great questions and probably would open up a whole other follow-up conversation, but I'll just be short and mention two things. One is I don't think reversal is necessarily anti-development or anti-emergence. I think that, again, that oscillation might be really important. But two, there is a very interesting overlap between the languaging and framing of reactionaries that want to retreat into an ethnographic past, or imagine that that will be the future, that everybody kind of goes back to their sort of ethnic origin point and we retreat from globalization in some way. And more bioregional conversations about localization, or Murray Bookchin's municipalism, or discussions around peer-to-peer economies and cosmolocalism. I think my languaging for this, the distinction I often use is there's a difference between globalization and this process of economic development and modernity as we've been doing it with economic capital, and what might be called planetization, which is there might be another way to go global without globalization. And I think we're trying to figure out what that is. And it might look like a cul-de-sac. It might look like a first attempt that dissolves and then folds back into a more complex emergence that looks like planetization. And I do think Latour talks about this as a kind of orthogonal move, right? That the back and forth, forward towards more development and globalization, backward towards a retreat from that is a kind of false dichotomy, or it's disconnected from the actual world and the planetary situation that we're in with the meta crisis. The orthogonal move is the move towards the terrestrial, which seeks for this new common ground while also kind of bringing back that localization. So for me, that the orthogonal move isn't necessarily backwards or forwards, but a kind of move from the sidereal realm that integrates. And I think that languaging or forms of language that are similar to that might be helpful to distinguish what we're talking about here, because certainly integrating bioregionalism, et cetera, indigenous thinking, indigenous complexity is probably going to be important for our survival. But we can't go back in the sense of the population being what it is. The only way to go back would be for everything to really collapse down to such a degree of loss of human life and other life, right? That wouldn't look great. So aside from entertaining ecocide and near human extinction, what are our options? It has to be some kind of tertiary move, right? So that's sort of where I go with that question.
Yeah, there's a deep, I think, very straightforward ambiguity about going back in human affairs. You know, not even very philosophically, but like everybody knows, if you get lost on a trail, you can go back to the crossroads. And that's a very smart thing to do. On the other hand, if you broke your leg skiing in the mountain, you're not going to try to fix your leg by climbing back to the top of the mountain where the incident occurred. So there's this very human ambiguity about whether going back is a useful or not useful thing. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I think we should be constantly aware that people who speak of reactionaries in particular, but anybody who speaks of a return, is as much inventing something new as they are thinking about return. It's just a way of extrapolating a new kind of future. I take very seriously the possibility of pathologies as regressions, but we have to be careful not to think that what we're regressing to is somehow the same as ancient or indigenous living styles from the past. Those are almost two different axes. But we should be cautious, definitely, about the danger of societies rolling back to more simplistic attractor states. That seems to get us into horrendous genocidal trouble. And I'm tempted to go into a much more cosmological domain, because I'm like, I would probably say that in the metaphysics of adjacency, time by its very nature slips past itself. And so you've always just missed it. And therefore, retroactively approaching time is the normal human relation in all phases. And therefore, we naturally overlay that on all histories, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have to go down that road, but I think it is normal for all of us to think of time as a looping back structure, because we always, even the present moment, is something we just passed by. And one more thing, which is to Jeremy's point a little bit about the additional move, the orthogonal move, the tertiary move. I think that's true, and I think that some of that move is negotiating the sweet spot, right? Because it's not about going forward or going back. If some people say we're going back, if they're not insane, they're usually saying we want to pull back a little right now in these circumstances. So there is this important adjacency issue of getting to the right threshold. And sometimes that means a little back, and sometimes that means a little forward.
I just want to say two things real quick. One is, yeah, I think it all depends on what the axis is that we are moving along, right? If we're conflating development with technological development, which I again wanted to argue, and I think this book argues, are not this, well, I mean, this isn't the exact argument it's making, but it's the implications of it, that the modes of production and technology are a different thing entirely than what we would think of as, say, complexity, right? But so if we are able to decouple those things, what if we can keep moving forward in some sense, but then maybe alter our sort of technological or relationship to technology and modes of production in a way that might temporally seem like we're going back to a time when things were very different in that domain, but that's not a regression. That's actually a progression. But I want to throw that out. And then I also wanted, speaking of time, just say that I should probably depart soon, and wanted to throw that out there if we wanted to do any quick summaries or any digestion.
Great, great. Yeah, we've gone for over 2 hours, and when Layman was going cosmic on the metaphysics of adjacency and the nature of time, I thought that'd be a good place to start wrapping it up. But to end, I kind of wanted to end on a bizarre note. And I think in a lot of these conversations, we focus a lot on the subject at hand, obviously, but as a kind of recurring motif or theme that's cropped up throughout this discussion, especially something you kept alluding to, Brendan, right, is what are all of the things that are not included in the book, right? What are all of the other contextual factors or variables or data points or perspectives that were not present that we should take into consideration to properly contextualize our reading and interpretation and conclusions that we're drawing from this book, right? So I have a thought experiment I want to frame like this. Are you guys familiar with M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, the movie? Okay, so let's say this is a thought experiment. So let's say that I grew up in a cult of the Graeber Wengrow cult. And this book is the only book I've ever read in my entire life, right? I'm 29 years old. This is the only perspective on history I know. So if I was coming to you three, and you knew that I was, I had such a particular angle on history through this book, and you wanted me to expand my lens and frame a little bit, right? And so I can better contextualize and digest all of these insights presented in the book, right? So I think of it not as a both and, but as a both and. And so the question is, what are the other ands? So Brennan, let me start with you. What are some other authors, books, sources, podcasts, materials, etc., that I should be looking into as this person who only grew up knowing this book that would help me to better round out my picture of how I should be digesting and assimilating this information?
That's an awesome question. I love it. It's a very helpful way of framing that, actually. So I would say this book is a critique of a standard narrative, and they say that explicitly, and they're saying we're offering a different story. I would say familiarize yourself with that other story and then get a better sense of what all the evidence is for that other story. Now, specifically, I mean, yes, the resources are plenty for that because it is up till recently, or I would argue it's still the consensus. I mean, this is, they're bringing in new information, but I would say that by far, if you were to talk to most anthropologists or historians and say, would you say it's more or less true or false that generally civilization proceeds from blah, 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 and goes to blah, blah, blah? They'd say, yeah, that's pretty much it. So yeah, I'm sort of on the spot to think up specific books that might do a good job of articulating that. I mean, they mentioned Vandermeer. I think I'm saying his name incorrectly, but he was an ancient Near Eastern historian. I have his textbook and was consulting that a little bit through this and kind of comparing notes and stuff. And it's an introductory book, but so anyway, there's that. But I would say, yeah, just familiarize yourself with that other narrative. Get some other textbooks that go over this period. Maybe use a couple instances like maybe focus on the Fertile Crescent and then maybe some instance in Mesoamerica somewhere, and try to familiarize yourself with sort of that narrative. Then read the footnotes and see what they're referencing, and on particular points where you might find, oh, they're making this argument here in this book about this happened after this, but maybe that's not true. You can go and consult their argument or their article that they reference. I mean, this is sort of just standard kind of scholarship, but it's part of the potential problem of a mass popular philosophical history book, right? Is that it's the kind of missing all that stuff. So if you give me a little time, I'd be very happy to actually maybe try to draw up a sort of bibliography of or something. But I would say that would be sort of the tack to take. And I guess just to throw into that mix, though, all of that would include this would be elements of evolutionary history in terms of the biogenetic substratum that out of which that occurs, the complexity theory, strange attractors, I mean, even down to the laws of physics, climatological progressions, the timeline of the point being that there are so many constraints imposed by our material conditions that it really helps to balance a narrative of volition and choice with, well, what might be some of those environmental constraints? And if I have a better sense of that, I think that would round out this book really well.
How about you, Jeremy? And Jeremy, you had mentioned earlier that they actually didn't include some information and research that they included in other articles that they didn't include in this book. So what are some other things people should familiarize themselves with to better grok some of these core insights?
I mean, I would throw in, again, Olga Soffer's work. I don't know how accessible it is for non-academics, but it's very interesting and engaging work for me. But and that's looking more at the specifically Paleolithic seasonal dualism and the environmental conditions. But it kind of is, to Brendan's point as well, that it's really looking at those material conditions and climatological conditions that enables seasonal dualism to flourish during that time. It's funny, I thought of two authors. One would be William Irwin Thompson. He has a short little book called Transforming History, and that might be a fun introduction if somebody was just going to grab something else, because he takes a very, again, consciousness and material realities, planetary material realities, to kind of play with each other, right? They go back and forth. So his whole map or schema or model of the evolution of consciousness is extremely contextual, based on riverine, oceanic, Mediterranean, right? So kind of an oceanic, transatlantic, right? And then he maps that with different forms of mathematical systems, but it's extremely geological and biospheric and bioregional. It's let's describe this particular epoch according to the material conditions, the resources, and then the scope of the world. So if it's rebuilding our cities around rivers, what does that afford us, right? What does that look like? How does that shape? Fertile Crescent with flood basins, et cetera, and river systems. Okay, that creates a whole different shape for how things are versus an oceanic culture. So I think thinking with that mattering, the mattering of meaning and the meaning of mattering is a really good practice. So William Irwin Thompson, Transforming History, is just a fun one-off. And then the other, I think, would be McLuhan, who's also doing that. He's looking at, he has that quip that I'm sure a layman is familiar with. We look at the future through the rearview mirror. And he's also playing with, again, how do technologies shape us? And then how do we shape the technologies, the communication mediums? And he has a sufficient enough breadth of complexity talking about our history, hey, oral cultures had this complexity that we don't have anymore, right? Literate cultures have new affordances that enable abstract thinking and et cetera, et cetera. So it's, again, a very kind of multidimensional, pliable model, which is nevertheless trying to think more ecologically, and then also relate our material conditions and communication mediums with our consciousness and culture. So getting people into that practice, I think, would be really good. So those are the two I'd throw out.
Yeah, I love all that stuff, especially in McLuhan, who's, other than me, Canada's greatest philosopher. I think that notion of the role that technologies, and particularly communication technologies, play in history and the way our worldviews are shaped is really important. McLuhan's not the only guy that does that, but he's prominent. I would suggest to this historically malnourished person you're talking about, that they also read Richard Dawkins, Brett Weinstein, and think about the evolutionary dynamics of how choices are made over history. Right? There's Marx looking at the material and economic structures. There's Wilhelm Reich looking at what are the conditions in our bodies and domestic practices that make any kind of society healthy or not healthy. There's Jeremy Rifkin looking at the history of different energy systems. There's Stephen Wolfram looking at how all of the computational options that are dialed into biology and neurology might already be present in computational space. Maybe we're not emerging or inventing them. Maybe we're just tuning them in or out. I think, classic thinkers, Gebser, Hegel, big picture guys. Wilbur's Up from Eden is still a really interesting and rich book on anthropology. There's a PBS podcast called Eons. They do both human and natural history, but they usually try to stay pretty up to date. And they're nice little 5 to 10 minute snippets of something you didn't know that we've discovered recently has actually been going on this planet. Nietzsche's Use and Abuse of History for Life presents 3 different styles of appropriating and building models of time. Really interesting, dense, provocative text. But also meditate deeply or take psilocybin in a museum or in an ancient site. Like, don't trust the sources of information. It's not all going to be in books. You might discover something they haven't noticed yet. So open yourself up to the experiential possibilities of what it's like for all you know, you have been alive for 1 billion years and you've been through all these things within yourself.
What a way to end. Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you guys. Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks for agreeing to do this. And I think this is a really fruitful chat that will hopefully make everyone a little bit pissed off and also very happy. So yeah, maybe we can do something like this again. And ahui ho.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ryan.
Big love. Love you all.
Yep.
Take
Lots of
care.
pleasure. Nice to talk with you
Take care,
guys.
guys.
You too. Bye.